Hello, welcome to World Civilizations up to 1500. Now, we're starting session 3 of the 8th topic titled Christianity and Islam, the Imperial Faiths. So, at the end of session 2, we started looking at part 3, Islam. We started getting into this new religious expression, this, a world religion it will become, as we'll see. And we looked at initially the geography of the Arabian Peninsula, how the geography was composed in terms of the, for example, the desert areas and pretty much pervaded most of that region. The coastal regions are going to be pretty much centers of international trade. And this is going to be, again, nexus points for the flourishing of new ideas, cultural, religious ideas, due to the fact that it was very much exposed to networks of foreign trade, commercial exchange. Merchants were the ones that were moving in and out of the Arabian Peninsula through those ports, like, for example, the city of Mecca and all the other centers of the Arabian Peninsula. And this is where we're going to see the rise of Islam. In session 2, at the very end, started looking at the rise of Muhammad, precisely in the city of Mecca. And he himself, as I explained in session 2, was a merchant, and he actually became a very wealthy merchant when he married a very wealthy woman from Mecca. And because he was exposed to foreign ideas, he is going to be very critical in formulating a new religious expression that was really not necessarily new, as I explained, because it took a lot of elements from Judaism, from this prophetic lineage going back to Abraham of monotheism, and also from Christianity as well. So it's going to be a new expression of both Judaism and Christianity, and it will be like a new chapter, so to speak, of monotheism in the Middle East. So we're in a moment when the Prophet Muhammad is going through a series of mystical experiences from 610 to 632, again in a cave just outside of Mecca. This is known as the prophetic revelatory period. So as I explained, all those revelations were compiled together in a book that became known as the Quran. And the Quran, of course, means the revelations. And this is going to become the holy book of Islam. As I explained, again, there are certain key components to the Quran, the biggest takeaways, if you will, of the Quran is that it stresses once again the idea of monotheism, that there's only one God in the universe. Okay. The other idea is that the path to God, in other words, the path that we attain union with the divine is by surrendering to God. Okay, so surrendering one's will, the limited ego to God. It also provides, the Quran, a moral code, of course, how people are supposed to behave, rules of conduct, for social relationships, etc., to achieve moral purity, so to speak. Okay, so there's really, a code of ethics. What is right, what is wrong, what people are supposed to do, to attain perfection, spiritual perfection. It also stresses the idea of the godly community, again, the Islamic community. We're going to be talking about pretty much in this third session about those Islamic communities. The formation of those Islamic communities will be central to the development and expansion of Islam, as we'll see. But this is, again, stress in the Quran, the idea that people, despite of tribal differences, linguistic differences, can indeed come together and bond with one another under one faith, serving one God, the godly Islamic community. Now, since According to Islamic tradition, the Quran was revealed directly from a divine source from heaven, and it was written in Arabic. It was prohibited the translation of the Quran into other languages because, once again, it was considered to be a divine revelation. Okay, so this can have, of course, advantages and disadvantages. The advantage is that, okay, so you're not going to really translate it into any other language, so there will be no mistranslations. Okay, that often happens with other scriptures. When they're revealed in a particular language, there is a certain understanding of what the words mean and the context and so on, that if you know that language, you pretty much understand what it says. But once you translate it into other languages, those meanings and those translations get lost from language to language again. So there's a certain essence that is diluted, if you will, across the translation process. Now, the disadvantage of not translating the Quran into other languages is that those that do not speak the language are not going to have access to the message. They're not going to be able to understand it or read it because it's only in Arabic, of course. So, there are, of course, advantages and disadvantages. Some scholars tend to stress more the disadvantages due to the fact that the Quran remained for a long period of time pretty much limited to people that were exposed to that language and were able to understand it. Okay. All right. So now the 5 pillars of Islam, as it is called, meaning that we're talking about the religion in general, not just the Quran, the book, but rather just in general. There are certain guiding principles, if you will, of Islam that those that profess and follow that faith ascribe to, and they follow, again, certain prescriptions. And there are 5, again, in Islam. The first one is to profess the faith. And the profession of the faith means that those that follow Islam renounce to all other gods. They will say there is no God but God, in other words. Okay, so it is really an affirmation that there's only one supreme being, one supreme creator of the universe, and that there are no other gods or goddesses or spirits that must be taken into account whatsoever. Okay, so it's an affirmation of monotheism. The second is praying 5 times a day. Now, there are, of course, different interpretations as to how this is done. Apparently, there are 2 different interpretations. One is that, well, people are supposed to pray 5 times a day by facing east, facing the position of the sun, to remember God's greatness. Now, later on, this became associated with the idea of facing the holy city of Mecca. For Islam, again, Mecca is a holy city. And to remember, of course, the Prophet and the birth of Islam, people are guided to pray 5 times a day by facing Mecca, the city of Mecca. Again, so there are 2, of course, interpretations to this prescription. The third is fasting during Ramadan. Okay, so there is a fasting period that lasts for about a whole month, and the Muslim calendar, and that is the 9th month, actually, of the Muslim calendar, in which throughout the day, those that undergo this prescription of the fasting do not drink or eat anything. Again, so as soon as the sun rises in the morning, there's nothing you can eat, nothing you can drink. Okay, and once the sun sets, then people gather and have a big celebration and feast. Okay, and this is a prescription that is intended to create empathy among the followers of Islam, to understand the suffering of the poor, of the less fortunate, that is to say, the people that are actually hungry, that do not have anything to eat, that really go for a day or several days without anything to eat. Again, so you can create that empathy, in other words. The fourth prescription is called almsgiving to the poor. That is, again, pretty much helping the poor, with Christians call charity, for example, is one of the prescriptions of Christianity as well. And the fifth is to undertake a pilgrimage to Mecca. Again, this is the birthplace of Islam, the city where the Prophet received the revelations, of course. And the believers, the followers of Islam, are guided to take a pilgrimage at least once in a lifetime. And the pilgrimage is intended for them to be reminded not only of the Prophet, but also of Abraham and monotheism. And they're supposed to visit that cube structure. I explained at the end of the second session, there's like a black stone, again, that goes back to Abraham. And people conduct a ritual. They walk around it several times, and they perform prayers and so on. And they stay in the city of Mecca for many, many days, and they create a sense of fraternity, brotherhood, sisterhood as well. And there's really a major convention taking place during the month of Ramadan. Particularly, again, the pilgrimage can be done at any time, during the year, but it is really during the month of Ramadan that there's a massive convention, in the city of Mecca. Now, according to some scholars of Islam, Muslim scholars, it is also understood that besides those 5 prescriptions, there was an added prescription as well in the faith, and that is jihad. Now, jihad, of course, started out initially, we're talking about the very, very initial moments when Islam was born, was understood to be an inner struggle, it's spiritual warfare, but it was more an internal spiritual warfare, whereby, again, this is going back to Zoroastrianism. We talked about that Zoroaster, that he talked about the right way, Artha, for example, that one of the ways that the dark force or the evil force is disrupting our lives is by entering our thought patterns, for example, causing confusion and fear, for example, or hate and so on, and that we should be vigilant, in other words, of those thoughts, and deny them, renounce to all kinds of negative thinking and so on, and just follow the right way, the right path. And so that's a struggle. It is a struggle perhaps with our own mind, with our own lower nature, our own negative ego. It can be seen in so many ways. Again, it's not necessarily an external force, but rather it could also be an internal force within ourselves, our own darkness that we're battling with, our fears and so on. And that there is, of course, a spiritual warfare. We must decide, in other words, what path to take. I mean, are we going to take the dark path, or are we going to take the path of the light? So that's what jihad intended to be. Again, it was totally internalized. It was something that was going on within ourselves. And as we'll see later on, much later, this concept is going to be externalized, in that instead of people understanding that this was an inner struggle, people are going to take this so-called spiritual war as a form of religious warfare or religious conflict, what we call holy war, in other words. Okay, a battle between different faiths or different religions, in other words. And we're going to get there eventually in just a few moments. All right, so now Islam is going to, as I just mentioned a few seconds ago, is going to take on not only Christian and Abrahamic elements from Judaism, but it's also going to take on Persian influences as well, like the concept of heaven and hell, righteous living, for example. They're totally embedded again in Islam, and they go back to Zoroastrianism. Again, this is the Persian religion that we covered in session 1. The idea of a paradise as well. The oasis, again, this heaven is pictured in Islam as an oasis. Again, in the desert, an oasis was really considered to be an ideal place that will offer you, water, for example, comfort, survival, for example, and pleasure. When you're in a desert, an oasis was just salvation, in other words. So this is the way that in Islam, paradise or heaven is going to be imagined or projected in a sense. Also, another Persian influence is autocracy. The fact that during the Persian Empire, the church and the state were one and the same. So really, the ruler of the Persian Empire was at the same time the supreme spiritual religious officer, in other words, commanding the religion and so on. This idea is also going to be embedded in the Islamic development, again, of the caliphs, for example, the religious leaders of the Islamic communities. There's going to be a marriage, if you will, of church and state. And this goes back to the Persian influence. And the idea of polygamy. This goes back to the Persians. The Persians practice polygamy, and this practice is going to be borrowed by the Bedouin tribal groups of the Arabian Peninsula, the nomadic tribes, for example. They also practice polygamy. And once we see the development of Islam, this practice that goes back to Persia is going to carry on under Islam as well. Okay, it's going to be totally permissible under Islam. Okay. Now, after the Great Revelation, we're going to see then another stage in the development of Islam called the Hijrah in 622, as Muhammad is beginning now to preach the message in the city of Mecca. He's going to create an uproar. There will be a lot of people that will follow him, and this created a lot of anxiety among the mercantile elite, the merchant princes that were ruling over the city, the aristocracy. And so they became very alarmed that this growing sect following Muhammad was going to disrupt the city, and it was going to disrupt also the religious celebrations that people carried out on a yearly basis and so on. So they decided to persecute him. Okay, so they are now persecuting Muhammad and his followers, and Muhammad is going to exile the city. He's going to be driven out, out of the city in the year 622. This is in the development and history of Islam. This is remembered, as an important moment that actually really marked the beginning of the Muslim calendar. Year 1 is the year 622 when Muhammad was exiled, and he went to the northern city of Medina. It was another city not as important as Mecca for in terms of the mercantile activities, but it was again another urban center that was also significant in that region. And he's going to be exiled, and he's going to continue preaching in the city of Medina, and he's going to really consolidate his movement in the city of Medina. So in the city of Medina, we're going to see the Prophet Muhammad really now consolidating Islam and his followers. And from there, we're going to see the formation of the very first Islamic community called the Ummah. Okay, the Ummah. This is the next stage. Now, he is in Medina, and he's now forming the very, very first godly community. We talked about that just a few moments ago. It is a community of believers. Okay, they follow Muhammad. He's going to become the leader of the community, And it's not just a community in the ordinary sense of the word, it's also a social and political Islamic community. It has a political organization, a political structure, and of course Muhammad is the leader of the community. Now, Muhammad is really gathering peoples from different tribal groups, and obviously tribal identity is put in question here, because remember, in the Arabian Peninsula, tribal identification came first before anything else. And people live by the tribal code of being loyal to the tribe, fighting for the tribe, and putting the tribe first before any other tribe. Now, as this community is encompassing different peoples from many different tribal backgrounds, something new is going to be created. You know, this Ummah, this religious community, this Islamic community, is going to transcend those tribal affiliations and create a whole new type of identity. Okay, so the tribal codes that people lived by were abolished altogether, and instead Muhammad introduced a new kind of tribe, not really tribal code, but a new law that is going to bind people together. Okay, it's not really a tribal law or a tribal code, but rather is more of a religious law. Again, and this became known as Sharia law. Okay, so Sharia law is really the law that will govern the community. So instead of following tribal prescriptions, they're going to be following the Quran. And during this time, Muhammad is continuing to write. You know, he has revelations, but now instead of having mystical revelations about the oneness of God and creation, he's now having revelations that deal more with temporal matters. You know, matters about civil issues, for example, marriage, you know, property contracts, for example, commercial transactions, divorce, and so on. Those kinds of issues, you know, criminal law, and so on. You know, how to actually govern society, what we call today civil law, for example. So he's going to be writing all those kinds of issues from a religious perspective, in other words. So he's going to be now adding to the Quran even more information that is going to pertain to what is called Sharia law. Again, this temporal religious legal code whereby people are going to follow and abide by and discard all kinds of tribal laws, you know, that they followed in the past. Okay, so there's again a new development. There's the creation now of a new community, so to speak. Now, as he's really growing his community in the city of Medina, he's now ready to go back to Mecca and conquer the city of Mecca. Okay, in the year 630, he's going to arrive to the city of Mecca, ready to enter the city and take it from the aristocracy. And instead of a very bloody confrontation, the city pretty much surrenders quite rapidly, due to the fact that by this time, most of the residents of the city had already converted to Islam. Okay, so this was a bloodless conquest of the city in 630. Okay, 2 years later, in 632, Muhammad dies, and this is going to give rise to yet another chapter, another era in the history and development of Islam. And this era is known as the Caliphate Era. Okay, so what is the Caliphate? So this is exactly what Muhammad created in the city of Medina. At least this is the embryonic stage, the early formation of the caliphate. You know, he was forming it, you know, in Medina. It's really an Islamic community led by a religious leader. And the religious leader is there to guide the community, to supervise it, and to enforce, of course, religious law as well. Okay? And this is going to be known as the Caliphate. Okay? What started out as the Ummah, for example, is now transforming into something much, much larger and highly organized as well. called the Caliphate. And the Caliphate is not going to remain limited to a specific region. Those caliphates, although they're going to be centered in one city, the headquarter or the capital, so to speak, of the caliphate will be centered in one location or one city. Territorially, they're going to expand significantly, and they're going to become the caliphates, the center of Islamic empires. Again, so there's going to be this tendency very early on in the history of Islam to expand the faith and to create what is called an Islamic empire as well. Okay. Now, we're going to look at three caliphates in this topic that pertain to the period of time that we're discussing here, roughly speaking, from the 630s all the way to, let us just say, the 1200s AD. Okay, there'll be three major caliphates that will really constitute the very first Islamic empires. Okay, so let us start with, first and foremost, the very first caliphate that, according to Muslim scholars, is called the rightly guided caliphate. It was short-lived. It spanned for, roughly speaking, about 30 years or so, from 632 to 661 AD. And remember that the Prophet Muhammad had already died in 632. So in a certain sense, that community that he just formed is going to be continued by his closest associates and family members. Okay, so once again, this is not necessarily divine succession necessarily, but there is a sense that those that were closest to Muhammad, again, that lived in his household, that were part of his closest family network or closest associates, that were directly, again, involved in the formation, again, of Islam and the Quran, that they had the right to continue the community or the so-called caliphate. Okay, Muslim scholars, again, call this caliphate the normative ideal. In other words, this was supposed to be the kind of ideal caliphate that is considered like the golden age of the Caliphate era. Again, very different from the other ones that came next after this, of course, as we'll see. This caliphate was headed throughout this time by four caliphs, and there were four caliphs or four leaders that ruled over this caliphate. Okay, it only had four. Okay, in that 30-year period. And they were ruling from Mecca and Medina. So Mecca and Medina will become the holiest cities in Islam. Again, because those were the birthplaces of that religion for reasons that I just explained. Okay? During this time, the faith expanded quite rapidly across the region. There were spectacular, what is called spectacular early conquests conducted under this caliphate from 632 to 655. Very, very rapidly. Again, it was really kind of a phenomenon. I mean, how quickly people were converting to Islam and how they were now living under this new guided community, okay, led by the caliphs in Mecca and Medina. For example, in the 1630s, the entire Arabian Peninsula fell under Islam. Okay, and those, for the most part, were bloodless conquest initially. There might be some resistance here and there, but for the most part, this is just spreading like wildfire. Okay, in 636, it spread to places like Syria, which is called Damascus, and Jerusalem as well, the Holy Land, in 636. By the 640s, it spread into the Persian Empire and also Egypt, again, to the really very large civilizations are now living under Islam, and in the Eastern Mediterranean, it spread in the year 655. Okay, so there's a massive expansion of Islam, as you can see in this map. It tells you the years where Islam expanded. The series of stages, starting in the Arabian Peninsula, and how quickly it was moving into the Persian Empire, Syria, Egypt, Jerusalem, the Eastern Mediterranean. Eventually, as we'll see, this expansion included most of North Africa, and as we'll see, it also included the Iberian Peninsula, what is today Spain and Portugal, okay, in Western Europe. Okay, as we'll see. I mean, this is something that we're going to get to see in the following caliphate. Okay, not necessarily on this one, but there's a massive expansion. Now, the reasons for this rapid expansion. What are the reasons for the rapid expansion of Islam? Okay, so there are several reasons. Well, first and foremost, and this is also consistent with what we saw in Europe with the expansion of Christianity. The fact that the Romans, had converted to Christianity, created a church, and because the Roman Empire was bent on expansionism, they also expanded the faith. Of course, they created the church, the Christian church, and they converted most of the nomadic groups of Europe, which were nomadic and warlike, the Germanic tribes. So there are certain parallels here in that the early converts and followers of Islam were the Bedouin and Arabian tribes of the peninsula, and a great many were nomadic and warlike. So this is going to be fundamental, of course, for the expansion of Islam, that we see, of course, nomadic groups, tribal groups that live by certain codes, most of which were founded on warfare. And this warlike culture is going to be the engine of expansion, okay, across the region. Another reason for the rapid expansion of Islam is that there was a kind of power vacuum in the Middle East due to the fact that the two largest empires, the Byzantine Empire to the west and the Persian Empire to the east, were in constant warfare with one another, and they were draining their resources constantly, and this created really a vacuum, so to speak, that the caliphates, in this case, filled in. In other words, there was an absence of leadership. That's what a power vacuum means. When the two largest powers or empires are fighting constantly and they're draining their treasuries, eventually they're going to become so weak, in other words, that a strong party is going to come in and pretty much take the lead. Okay, that's exactly what happened here. Now, the empires of the region also were very oppressive, in terms of the taxes they extracted from the populations, and also the religious intolerance. They often went against the local customs and then the local cults, and trying to impose their own imperial faith on the population. And what many of the people that pretty much fell to the Muslims saw in the expanding Islamic faith was that, well, the conquerors, in this case, were not really there to convert them necessarily. They were not there to impose a religion, okay? And so this is another issue that people felt compelling, to discard the other empires and instead embrace the one that was pretty much offering them far more autonomy, okay? Because the caliphates, in this case, were not necessarily conquering to own necessarily the cultures or to own the territories, but rather just to impose their rule, okay, to impose the rule. It was about sovereignty. Sovereignty is that they were there to be the new authority of the realm, okay, the new lords, if you will, of the land, not to really own the territories. And the other issue is that they were also kind of granting significant autonomy, self-rule in terms of cultural and religious issues and practices. So people could continue their own practices in private. All they needed to do is acknowledge now that there's a new lord, of course, the Muslim lords in this case, pay taxes, if you will, but they were there to pretty much carry on their ancestral traditions. Okay. Now, another issue is that in many of the regions that they invaded, for example, the Persian Empire, including the Eastern Mediterranean, where there were Zoroastrians, for example, there were Christians, there were Jews, for example. People were already very much familiar with the message of monotheism because they had monotheistic faiths, monotheistic religions. And so they saw in Islam a familiar message, so to speak, that was consistent with their own monotheistic traditions. Okay, so that's another issue, why this religion is going to spread, so fast and so quickly. Now, by the year 655, what we're going to see is a crisis in the Muslim world. Okay, eventually there's going to be a civil war, and this civil war spanned for a few years from 655 to 661. And so the Muslims will become divided on one issue, not necessarily on theological issues, relating to the message, in the Quran or etc., but rather it was the issue of succession, leadership. Okay, who is entitled to rule? Okay, as one leader dies, then how do we choose the next leader of the caliphate, the next caliph, in other words? How do we choose them? Who is the rightful heir to the position of leader and guide that Muhammad started out? And we're going to see the Muslims dividing into two factions. And they both have very different interpretations about succession. Okay? On one hand were the Fatimids, as they were called. Okay, the Fatimids were a faction that was closely associated with the Prophet. They claimed that they were the heirs in this divine lineage. They believed that the leaders of the Caliphate had to be the closest relatives, family members, or associates of the Prophet Muhammad. Okay, so they favored something called divine lineage. Because, well, the Prophet, was actually chosen by God to deliver the message. So this is like a holy office of sorts. So it's only somebody that comes from that holy lineage, they will say, is entitled to rule. Again, a family succession, in other words. So they're, in a certain sense, favoring a more theocratic form of leadership. A theocracy, that is to say, in which the rulers are actually religious figures. Okay, religious figures closely associated with the Prophet Muhammad. Okay, that's what a theocracy is. Now, the opponents of the Fatimids, as they were called, were the Umayyads, and that was actually a family from Syria. Okay, it's a dynastic family, as a matter of fact, that contested the claim of the Fatimids that, well, if we are going to be basing succession based on this divine lineage, whereby only family members or descendants of the Prophet Muhammad will be entitled to lead and rule, then this is going to create corruption, what is called nepotism. In other words, that this is just one family, pretty much like a dynasty, in control of the caliphate, and all of the major important posts in the administration will be given to family members. So only members of the family will be the leaders and the beneficiaries of the community, of the resources, for example, and the taxes and the like, and what is called nepotism. They preferred a non-family succession and the idea that you don't need to be a priest as well in order to rule. What is called secular rulers. Those could be a general, a chief, for example, an administrator, that anybody could become the caliph, in other words. You don't have to be a family member of the prophet, a relative, or even a priest. Okay? And this is going to split the two factions into what is today still are known as the two major warring factions of the Muslim world, the Shia and the Sunnis. Again, the Shias are the heirs of the Fatimids, again, the divine lineage kind of sect, and the Sunnis are more of the secular, Muslims, again, that believe that the community could be indeed just be governed by any kind of ruler, Now, in the civil war, ultimately, the Umayyads, those that prefer a non-family succession, the secular faction in this case, ended up defeating the last caliph of the Caliphate, Ali. Okay, they defeat him, and he's actually assassinated, as a matter of fact. And the Umayyads, this new dynasty, takes over, and now they create another caliphate. It's called the Umayyad Caliphate, that lasted from 661 all the way to 750 AD. And they moved the capital from Mecca and Medina to Damascus in Syria. Okay, so the capital is changed. Now, during the Umayyad Caliphate, Islam undergoes another expansion, and this expansion is taking place in North Africa, where it's Morocco, for example, but also the expansion takes place in Western Europe. There are Muslim forces that move into the Iberian Peninsula, and they conquer Hispania. It's called Hispania or Spain in 711. So Hispania fall to the Muslims again. So the Umayyads pretty much extend their imperial control into Western Europe as well. And in 732, they're trying to push the borders into southern France, what is called Gaul. Southern Gaul was what today is southern France. But the forces, the Frankish forces led by Charles Martel, stopped the Muslims in 732, and they pretty much put a halt to the Muslim advance in Europe. Charles Martel. Okay, so that is a very, very important development in the history of Islam. Now, during the Umayyad Caliphate, we see for the very first time Islam's first imperial rule. The very first caliphate was perhaps the formative stages of that. Islam was indeed expanding in many directions, but it was not ruled as an empire. But the Umayyads are going to rule the entire caliphate as an empire. Okay, all this area that you see there in gray, the Umayyad Empire is an Islamic empire ruled from Damascus in Syria, is going to be ruled as an empire, and it's going to be ruled in many cases based on the Roman model. Okay, the Roman model. For example, when it came to succession, it would be hereditary succession. It was, the succession of the caliph, the leader of the caliphate, will be passed on from father to son, and so on and so forth, just like the Romans, for example. It will be also decentralized in many cases, in that, for example, the Romans were not really interested in changing the culture, of the local populations that they control. That's what we mean about decentralized. It was about tribute collection, for sure. The Romans, as well as the Umayyads, were just interested in collecting tribute from the local populations and leaving them alone to carry out their own religious traditions. So there's an incredible religious diversity taking place across the Umayyad Caliphate, this empire. Okay. However, the religion itself, Islam, was fundamental for the political legitimacy of the Caliph. In other words, the Caliph, although he's allowing all this religious diversity to take place and religious freedom, the fact that he is representing Islam and he's representing this lineage, if you will, going back to Muhammad, that he is the protector of the faith. He's not really, again, connected in family networks to the Prophet, again, as we already saw, of course, but he's claiming that he is guiding the community, he's protecting Islam, and he's advancing Islam in many directions. Again, that gave him the legitimacy to be the actual ruler. Okay. Now, during the Umayyad Caliphate, we're going to see the rise of an aristocracy. The Arabs are going to be dominant during the Umayyad imperial system. They're going to dominate the bureaucracy. They're going to be in charge of the entire administration, and they're going to be the topmost class of the entire empire. This is the time when Arabic becomes the universal language of the empire. Okay, so there is a common language. There is really an official language. Of course, there's a multiplicity of different languages spoken across the empire, but for official purposes and for also religious and intellectual pursuits, Arabic was the universal language of the empire. Now, remember, this is a secular caliphate. In other words, this is not really guided by priests. This is not a caliphate whereby the priests are the ones ruling society. This is not, in other words, a theocracy. This is a secular government. So therefore, we're going to see the creation of religious scholars, the ulema, as they were called. The ulema are the religious scholars that are going to be the educators of society, for example. They're going to be deciding on all kinds of legal matters. They're going to be deciding on political issues and so on. They're, in other words, the intellectuals. And they are indeed religious scholars, but they're not religious priests. Again, so they're just scholars. And the religious scholars are the ones that are studying the Quran and making it, accessible to people, explaining it, and pretty much creating a legal system as well, whereby they're informing the judges how to carry out their legal functions based, of course, on scripture as well. Again, so there's something central to the Umayyad imperial system that distinguishes from the more religious-oriented caliphate that we're going to be talking about in just a few moments, the Abbasids, that are going to be more centered on the priest pretty much leading society and not necessarily the scholars. Okay, so the Umayyad Caliphate will eventually come to an end. There will be a fall, so to speak, and the fall of the Umayyads go back to, for example, a growing resentment against Arab supremacy. There were a multiplicity of different ethnic groups that resented that the Arabs were dominating the bureaucracy. They had become an aristocracy, very wealthy, very influential, and they dominated the topmost positions, again, of the administration. There's also Arab tribal divisions as well that make the Umayyad Caliphate very, very fractured as well. There are also rumors and accusations that the Umayyad dynasty was growing very, very corrupt, the impious conduct, that they were not behaving according to the norms, the moral code of the Quran, and there was a lot of scandals, in other words. So they were losing a lot of legitimacy. This was a tarnish on their reputation, okay? And eventually, by the year 750, because of those weaknesses and problems and internal divisions and fractures, there's going to be a rebellion against the Umayyads. And we're going to see a faction really led by one of the descendants, closest relatives of the Prophet. The leader was called Abbas. He was leading the Abbasids, as they were known, in a rebellion against the Umayyads. And finally, in the year 750 AD, the Umayyads will be toppled by this growing group, this emergent group. This is the other faction, goes back to the Fatimids, that we talked about, again, that are more priestly, more about divine lineage, and the idea that those closest to the Prophet should be in control of the Caliphate. So by 750, we see now the beginning of a new caliphate from 750 to 1258. Okay, and as I mentioned, it was this leader. His name was Abbas. He was a descendant from Muhammad, apparently, and they were disgruntled at the fact that the Umayyads had taken over the Caliph and moved the capital to Damascus, for example, and now they had created this faction known as the Shiites. The Shiites, they're the religious faction that favors more a divine succession, family succession, if you will, for the leadership. Now, they staged a rebellion against the Umayyads, and this rebellion was quite a bloody one, to the point that they led a coup to oust the Umayyads from power, and they were not content with removing the caliphs, the Umayyad caliphs, from power in Damascus, but they also wanted to pretty much eliminate all the entire Umayyad dynasty. There were more than 50 members of the entire royal family. All of them are going to be eliminated during this coup, except for one. There was one survivor, actually, of the Umayyad dynasty, and this one survivor was able to flee the Middle East, and he moved into Egypt. He moved into North Africa, and then eventually Morocco, and then from Morocco he went into Spain for refuge. And in Spain he was received as the last heir of the Umayyad dynasty and declared as the rightful heir to the Caliphate. So therefore, Spain is not going to be part of this new Abbasid Caliphate that is going to be centered more in the city of Baghdad. So again, Spain still continues to be Muslim, but is controlled by the last survivor of the Umayyad dynasty. Okay, and this is going to create a schism, if you will, in the Muslim world, because now the capital of the new caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, is moved to Baghdad. This is the Abbasid headquarters, the city of Baghdad. So during this time, we're going to see now three regional centers in the Islamic world. We got one in Spain, controlled by the Umayyad, of course, the survivor that I mentioned. Egypt is also going to separate from the Abbasid and the Umayyad, and Cairo, again, is going to be a total separate region of Islam, and of course Baghdad again. So there will be three regional centers, or three caliphates, so to speak, coexisting at the same time during the Abbasid Caliphate, as you can see in this map. It tells you exactly the regions that were controlled by which group. Spain in red, you can see, is an Umayyad emirate, again, led by the Umayyads. The Abbasid control all this green region, as you can see, right? So it is fractured and is divided. This is not really a single empire as it was back during the era of the Umayyad Caliphate. Now, this is a Shiite Caliphate, the Abbasid. Again, this is a different faction now that is in control. The Caliph, in this case, is the absolute authority. This is a theocracy. Again, it's a total theocracy. So the ruler, himself becomes like a sort of quote unquote like a holy person. He is the ruler, but he's also the religious figure, leader of the community, and he claims a status of divinity because of their connections back to Muhammad as well. And the whole purpose of the Abbasids was to establish what is called religious orthodoxy. Okay, in other words, that look, we must establish, very clearly all the norms and all the rules of Islam, so they become the norms for all society in every area of society. In other words, not just the religion, but also the legal codes in society, the sciences, the literature. Everything must be totally transformed. So every aspect of society becomes an expression, in other words, of religious law. So during this time, we see Sharia law becoming institutionalized. Okay, it becomes an institution throughout the entire spectrum of human society. Okay, now during the Abbasid era, it should be noted that it is remembered an era in which Islam reached its full splendor, so to speak. There was commercial and intellectual achievement in terms of, for example, there was a commercial revolution during this time by the introduction of Indian crops into the Abbasid Caliphate, for example, rice, sugarcane, banana, eggplant, and those crops are going to increase the population on one hand, but also the exports as well. Okay, so this is going to become a mercantile empire, a merchant empire, in other words. And of course, as we see very wealthy merchants and great fortunes being created, the merchants are going to sponsor the arts and sciences. They're going to become the patrons of the new arts, and for example, in literature and architecture, for example. There will be magnificent palaces built in the city of Baghdad. The city of Baghdad will become one of the marbles of the Middle Ages. Again, we're talking about now the Middle Ages is not necessarily the ancient world. This is now the Middle Ages. And Baghdad was just a marble. Again, there were magnificent structures, palaces, temples. It was just, again, a magical sight, to be in that city during this time. So all this construction work was sponsored by the wealthy merchants, including the arts, sculpture, paintings, for example, works of art in terms of literature, so on. Mathematics, for example, we see the beginning of algebra. Algebra comes from this period of time. We see the development of algebra and also alchemy. Okay, now the science of trying to transform lead into gold. One of the goals of the alchemists was how to transform lead into gold. This also comes from these times. Those are Arabian words, algebra and alchemy. One of the works of literature that comes from this period of time, of the Abbasid Caliphate, were the translation, for example, of Greek and Roman classics. The works of Aristotle, for example, and Plato, and all the other Greek rationalists, for example, and mathematicians, were all translated during this time in the city of Baghdad. So there were great libraries as well. There were hundreds of thousands of books, repositories of knowledge being guarded there. So again, this was a very, very vibrant city, not only commercially, but also intellectually. And that gave us also the epics, such as the 1000 Arabian Nights, for example, as well, from which later on the story of Aladdin came from as well, again, from this epic story, 1000 Arab Nights, that really talk about the deeds, the epic deeds of the Abbasids, okay? Now, it was a very diverse empire, Islam, during this time. Remember, there were 3 caliphates. But despite the fact that there were 3 caliphates, there was a lot of cultural unity during this time. There was a common culture, one common cultural universe, standard of customs, manners, and laws all over, again, the Islamic world. there were three main institutions that if you travel, let's say from North Africa to Egypt, or you travel to Baghdad or Syria or the Eastern Mediterranean or Spain, you will find a certain commonality in the Islamic world because of three institutions. One was the College for Religious Education. Okay, the College for Religious Education. This is the college that was producing, of course, the scholars, in the Muslim world. The Sufi Brotherhood. This was a mystical branch of Islam dedicated to connect personally with the divine. So this is a more mystical version of Islam, the Sufis, in other words. Very similar to like the Vedantas, for example, of India, like the mystics, for example, of India. And of course, the caravan of traders. Again, this is another very, very characteristic that you will find pretty much all over the Islamic world. And that gave people a sense that they were, despite the fact that they lived in different caliphates, that there was a certain cultural unity, a certain standard that created a very familiar environment throughout the Islamic world. So the fall of the Abbasids come about in the 1200s. There is fragmentation in the caliphate. And this fragmentation was not only internal, but also external. There's, of course, the invasions by the Mongols. The Mongols are considered, by the standards of the day, barbarians coming from northern Asia. They're now bent on conquering the Middle East. They asked the Abbasids to surrender the caliph to the Mongols. And when they refused, the Mongols unleashed destructive forces in the year 1258 against Baghdad, and they destroyed the entire city. The entire city was destroyed to the ground. Again, libraries, palaces, everything was destroyed, books were burned, and 800,000 people were murdered by the Mongols. Again, 800,000 people were murdered. And so this was, again, a very destructive event, it was terrifying, in the Muslim world. The entire Muslim world was terrified about, the Mongol invasion. And the Abbasid dynasty suffered a very terrible fate at the very end of the destruction. They were arrested, so to speak, by the Mongols. All the family, all the royal dynasty was gathered, and they were wrapped up in carpets, and they were trampled upon by horses. So they were crushed again by the Mongol cavalry as well. I mean, this was a very, very gruesome execution of the leadership as well. And that was really the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. Now, part 4 is going to look at the Crusades. And rather quickly, again, in the Crusades, we're going to see a clash of imperial faiths. The two imperial faiths, Christianity and Islam, are going to clash in a series of battles, so to speak, otherwise known as the Crusades. Now, the background, rather quickly, this goes back to the Roman Empire itself. The Germanic tribes, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this session, they're going to play a key role in the Crusades, because when the Roman Empire was about to collapse, a great many Germans actually become part of the Roman army. Again, so the Romans actually incorporated many of the Germans into the Roman ranks, to fight for the Roman Empire. And remember, the Germanic tribes are nomadic and very warlike. Again, so they're going to be very, very aggressive. And the fall of Rome in the year 450 AD was also due to the Germanic invasions. The Germans actually invaded the Roman Empire, and this led to the fall of Rome as well. Again, so the Germans are playing a key role, again, in the remaking of Europe. Because after the fall of the Roman Empire in the year 450 AD, we're going to see that the Roman Empire was broken up into a series of kingdoms that were now led and governed and ruled by the Germanic warlords. So we're going to see, again, after the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe now being divided by the German warrior kings. Again, the Visigoths ruled Spain, the Ostrogoths ruled Italy, The Merovingian rule Gaul, or what is France. The Anglo-Saxons rule England, and the Lombards rule over Italy as well. Again, those are all Germanic tribes, all of them. Now, I mentioned that the Germans convert to Christianity. When the Romans convert to Christianity and they send missionaries far and wide across Europe, the Germans and the German kings convert to Christianity. So this is going to be very, very essential for understanding the Crusades, that now Christianity is really now led by the heirs of the Roman Empire, again, the Germans, in other words. And remember, just like the Arabs, they were nomadic, they were very warlike, and their interpretation of Christianity is going to be far more militaristic and more militant. Now, the Muslims, of course, invade Europe. This is another element that leads to the Crusades. In the years, in the 700s, for example, the Byzantine Empire is raided by the Muslim forces, which were stopped. Again, the Byzantine army actually stopped them by using Greek fire. It was really a chemical that actually stopped them from actually destroying Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. But as I said, in the 700s, 711, for example, 711 AD, all the way to 760 AD, the Muslims take over Iberia, Hispania, or Spain, in other words. It falls to the Arabs, and now the Arabs are taking control of portions of Western Europe. Again, so that led, of course, to changes in Europe. We see now in Europe military change and social change. In other words, the Europeans now see a threat, a menace, now that they're being invaded, in other words, from the east. The Muslims are invading them from the east in Byzantium, but also from the west, again, in Spain as well. This led to a lot of changes. For example, the acquisition of horse technology, building castles for protection. And so this is medieval Europe. And medieval Europe is acquiring a whole new orientation, and the orientation is defense, in other words. Defense, warfare, technology is on the rise. The other element that led to the Crusades was the creation of the Holy Roman Empire. Again, we're going to see the resurrection of the Roman Empire, but it's more Christian, in other words. And the architect of the Holy Roman Empire was Charlemagne. He was the ruler of the Frankish kingdom. This was what used to be Gaul in the past, what today is France, for example. Again, it's called the Frankish kingdom. It was a Germanic also kingdom led by Charlemagne. And in the year 850, Charlemagne was crowned by Pope Leo III as a Christian king, giving him now the mantle of being the protector of Christianity in a time of menace and threat. In other words, that look, we're facing an existential threat. Christianity is suffering, of course, a heavy blow with the invasions from Islam. And so Charlemagne was supposed to unite all of the Germanic kingdoms together under his leadership for the purpose of creating a new kind of Roman Empire, but it's holier, it's Christian. And the idea was that every ruler of Europe must defend the faith, that the purpose of every king, prince, ruler in Europe was not just to rule the kingdom, but also to defend Christianity and advance the faith as well. So this gave, of course, Christianity a more militant character, more so than ever before. And this is going to lead to the Crusades themselves. Again, as we're going to see now, the Crusades, meaning now there's going to be a conscious effort to defend Christianity from the Muslim advance everywhere in Christian Europe, and also to try to spread Christianity everywhere as well. This is now the new mission, in other words, of the Holy Roman Empire, and of course of the German kingdoms that we just discussed, that converted to Christianity, and because they had this nomadic background, they're going to be, of course, pushing, of course, the Muslim armies, out of different regions, particularly in Europe. Again, for example, it all started in Spain. We see the Spanish Reconquest, what is called La Reconquista. The Spanish Reconquest was a process by which the local population inside of Spain, aided by the Frankish forces of Charlemagne, to the north, are going to be pushing the Muslims out of Spain. Was a long process that spanned from, let's say, 800 all the way to the 1300s AD. It spanned for centuries. This is an ongoing fight, as you can see in this map. Again, how slowly but surely the Muslims are losing ground. The area of green, their caliphate, is being reduced as the centuries go by. Again, so by 1491, they ended up with just a small portion, again, of the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula. This reconquest gave certain kingdoms their independence. For example, Portugal gained this independence from the Muslims in 1147. Again, so we see the emergence of the Kingdom of Portugal. It's totally independent now. Spain gained its independence from the Muslims in the year 1467. So we see the formation of the Kingdom of Spain, and the last Muslims were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula in 1491, just 1 year before Columbus discovered America. Again, finally they were expelled. So this completed, again, the kind of reconquest, or La Reconquista, as it was called, of Spain. And so this was a major crusade. Another one was a battle for Jerusalem, the Holy Land, which was conquered by a new group that had just arrived from Central Asia, the Seljuk Turks, as they were called. I mean, they also waged war against the Chinese Empire, the Seljuk Turks as well. We covered that in a previous topic. Now they come into the Middle East, and they conquer Jerusalem, and while they're there, they're going to convert to Islam. This happened in the year 1037 AD. So again, the Turks now take control of Jerusalem. And so the Turks, not content with just conquering Jerusalem, they're going to try to conquer also the Byzantine Empire. They're going to raid Constantinople in the year 1071, and they defeat the Byzantine forces. So the Byzantine forces appeal to the Germanic kingdoms and the Pope in Rome for help and aid, to help them send forces to fight, in other words, the Muslims, and recovered the land of Jerusalem as well. Okay, so the first crusade was launched in the year 1096, and those are Germanic Christian armies that arrive now to the Holy Land, and they battle the Turks, and they removed the Turkish control, at least for about a century, and they installed a series of 4 Crusader kingdoms. Again, those Christian armies, those are Germans, in other words, they installed 4 kingdoms: Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, and Jerusalem. As you can see in the Holy Land in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Crusaders actually build 4 kingdoms. And again, they're going to hold on there for about a century until they're going to be repelled once again by the Turks. And again, they're going to be totally driven out of the Holy Land. Again, this was not considered a very successful campaign, so to speak. It only lasted about 100 years. The domination, again, of the Christian armies of the Holy Land. The end result is that we see medieval castles built in the Holy Land. While those 4 kingdoms were established, we saw that there were about 4 kingdoms built there, and each kingdom built a series of castles for fortification purposes, for defense purposes. Those were medieval castles in the Holy Land. We see a great military technological revolution taking place both in Europe but also in the Muslim world. We're going to see that because of the Crusades, both are investing very heavily in the development of new military technologies as well. We saw also the rise of the European Crusader kingdoms as well. Again, so now the kingdoms of Europe become crusaders. They're militant. Again, the Christians again are now building armies, formed by knights in this case, and the knights are fighting not only for land or fighting for the king, they're also fighting for the cross. Their idea is that they're trying to evangelize and spread the faith, this evangelizing Christian spirit, in other words. This becomes really the new spirit of Europe. Okay? But in the Arab world, we're going to see something similar taking place, in which in the Arab world, the population is going to be mobilized into something called jihad. Again, we talked about jihad being an inner spiritual warfare, an inner struggle to conquer our own lower dark nature, for example. Well, this is going to be now externalized, and the Arab world is going to see this spiritual warfare in terms of battling, in other words, those of different faiths, in other words, the Crusades, in other words. Jihad is going to take a more outer expression. Okay. All right, so what we have covered so far, the summary points in this topic, there are several points I want to stress here, and that is, well, we covered at great lengths two world religions, Christianity and Islam. And as we mentioned since the very beginning, those are really religions that were born in Mesopotamia, again, in the Middle East, and they take on many of the ideas of the Mesopotamian worldview, going back to Judaism and Zoroastrianism, the idea of monotheism, of only one God, dualism, God and the opponent, the dark force, if you will, good and evil, God and Satan, so on, ethics, that people should behave in an appropriate manner, the right way, and so on, because after all, at the end of one's life, we go into an afterlife, whether we're going to be rewarded in a paradise or in a place of punishment to be, again, for eternity, to be penalized, in other words, and there's this idea of the end times, the eschaton, that there will be a judgment day. God will separate the sheep from the wolf, and there will be a great battle between the forces of light and darkness. They pretty much carry on those Mesopotamian ideas. In terms of the founders and promoters of Christianity and Islam, we see that in Christianity there are four founders and promoters. Of course, Jesus is the founder, but St. Paul, Constantine the Great, and St. Augustine were the major promoters of Christianity, in their own way. Okay, St. Paul by pretty much clarifying theological issues, Constantine by creating the Christian church, and St. Augustine by creating the medieval idea of the Christian self, the saintly person that moves into a monastery in solitude and achieves the state of grace, what is called sainthood, in other words, okay, and provides pretty much the blueprint for Christian Europe. In Islam, it was Muhammad, again, the Prophet Muhammad, who is not really regarded as divine, unlike Jesus, of course. Jesus is actually regarded as divine, the Son of God, but under Islam, Muhammad is just considered just another prophet, in other words. And the caliphs, of course, are going to be the big promoters, if you will, of the faith, promoting it and expanding it far and wide. Now, the reason why those two religions that started out as sects, so to speak, are going to become major world religions was due to the fact that, on one hand, they grew up in an era of empires. Okay, Christianity, for example, emerged and spread in the heart of the Roman Empire. Okay, so the Roman Empire, although it persecuted the Christians, tried to do away with the sect, eventually ended up incorporating it into its official religion, again, creating the Christian church. And the Christian church was responsible for evangelizing all of the nomadic groups of Europe, the so-called pagans, like the Germanic tribes, for example. In the Islamic world, those were the caliphs. The caliphs created empires, as we already saw, like the Umayyad, for example, and the Abbasid. And as a result of those two caliphs or caliphates, we see the massive expansion of Islam to the point that it became a world religion. So the fact that those religions were coming about in an era of empires, explain why they're going to become, so to speak, universal faiths or universal religions. And in fact, those were more of imperial faiths, as a matter of fact. Also, because those imperial systems had a vast system of trade networks that allowed for the rapid spread of the faith. You know, the Roman Empire had built, of course, a series of trading networks and roads, and those roads were used by the apostles and the missionaries to actually carry on the message from city to city, from port to port, and facilitated the spread of the faith. The same way with the caliphs, again, with the caliphates as well. You know, there was a series of trade networks that existed in the Arabian Peninsula, and in Egypt, for example, and the Persian Empire. And those trade networks facilitated also the spread of those two faiths as well. Now, those two world religions also transcended tribal identification. They created a new kind of identity in world history, and that is the creation of religious communities. So instead of being identified with your tribe, and that's the group that you belong to, those two religions created another kind of community in which people that shared the same faith became members of your group. So now we have a community of believers, in other words. So there's a new identification, there's a new social or group identity on the rise with Christianity and Islam. And last but not least, the fact that those two religions were also spread among nomadic populations, like the Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula that were very warlike, you know, and also the Germans in Europe that were also very warlike. That created a certain militancy, so to speak, that those religions also became very militant, in that instead of just being very inward oriented, they became very outward oriented, because again, the populations that were converted first were nomadic and warlike. So they're going to be spreading the faith, and eventually we're going to see, of course, a clash, a conflict between those two groups, producing, of course, the Crusades. Again, that explains, of course, a lot. Again, the nomadic background of Christianity and Islam producing the so-called Crusades. Okay, so this is all I have for you. We have concluded this topic. This is the end of this topic. I'll see you then in the last topic that will come next, the ninth topic, that will look at the barbaric or nomadic invasions in world history, the Vikings, Mongols, and Aztecs, when we come back. Thank you.